When I first started visiting Syria in the 1990s, it really stood out as a place that was quite different from the other countries that I was visiting and had visited in the region. Essentially, I really did get the sense at the time that this was a very important country. It was a kind of a linchpin country. It sort of was the gateway to kind of the more, interior hinterland Middle East. Yet it also had a coastal connection. It sort of stood at the sort of crossroads. I mean, people talk a lot about Turkey being this great bridge between East and West, and it is. It isn't, because of that sort of that Istanbul straddling the two literal continents. But in some ways, when I think about Syria, it feels almost Syria is really the kind of the sort of the bridge.
Welcome to Upstream. Today we have a very special treat. We have John Zada with us. John is one of the co-founders of the Conciliators Guild, which is the organization behind Upstream. So welcome, John, to this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
A great pleasure. Let me introduce you a bit to everybody who will be listening. John is an author and journalist who writes about travel and the interplay between culture and politics. He's lived and worked extensively in the Middle East and produced work for the Globe and Mail, CBC, BBC, Los Angeles Review of Books, among many others. He's also the author of two other nonfiction books, Veils of Distortion, How the News Media Warps Our Minds, and very interesting work, and In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch. But today we're not going to be talking about the Sasquatch. We're going to talk about John's new book, which is the real trigger for this conversation. It's called The Patchwork Cloak of Kamal Bay, an East-West memoir. Here it is. I highly recommend everybody to read it. It's a fast-paced, fun ride through the Middle East. John, thanks for writing such an interesting book. What exactly inspired you and motivated you to do this book?
So a bit of background first. My parents were born and raised in Cairo, Egypt, and their families came to Egypt originally from other parts of the Middle East, from the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, southeastern Turkey. And they moved to Canada in the late 1960s, where I was later born. And so I grew up in this sort of, Middle Eastern household milieu, being both Eastern and, Western, being a Canadian. And I was always fascinated in the Middle East, partly because my parents sat in front of the television, constantly watching the news. At the same time, they never really went back and they never took me back. So I developed this intense fascination with the region, and also felt at the same time that there was something missing in terms of my cultural mix, a deeper sense of a connection to the East. And so, starting in young adulthood, beginning as a backpacker traveling the world, I started to go to the region. That led afterwards to studying at the American University in Cairo, doing my master's degree there, which led to a very intense few years exploring Egypt, and then later working as a journalist in television and documentary. I spent a bunch of time in Dubai, working on a very long series about war and about war in the Middle East, which took me to a whole bunch of countries in the region over those years, and some incredible access and experience and encounters with unusual characters, and then another stint with Al Jazeera English in Doha, and then a whole bunch of freelance writing trips that I'd done afterwards, basically. And I collected this really large array of travel experiences, which I'm sure were quite remarkable. And so, fast forward a bunch of years to the end of COVID, where I just finished my second book, Veils of Distortion, And I'd faced that, that universal conundrum of writers and authors when finishing a book. Well, what do I do next? And I really didn't have anything ready to go as a next project. And I toyed a little bit with fiction. I explored the idea of doing another travel log similar to the Sasquatch book, which would have involved another big trip and spending a bunch of money. And so it sort of just hit me, well, why don't I do uh, a book about my travels in the Middle East, in the past, a book that would combine reportage, memoir, travelogue, and have within it this sort of quest theme of myself looking for something, being in search of that sort of elusive, deeper Easternness that I was looking for on my travels. And so uh, basically that's the genesis and the origins of the book, and I just pursued that as my next book.
So you've done. I've read all of your books, and you've done different styles of books. One is a nonfiction about news, well worth reading. Well, about the damage news does, really. Another that's a travel book, but more straightforward in a way. And then this one, which is this incredibly rich array of anecdotes. How did you find writing this book? How was it more difficult, less difficult, more interesting for you as a writer? How did that feel, writing this book?
It was actually a more interesting process, and ironically, because I was presented with a bit of a dilemma from the outset, and that was I, didn't want to do a collection of individual stories that would be purely or mostly standalone in the manner of a collection of short stories. Say, I needed to make the stories somehow connected or interlocking without it being just a unitary narrative or story. And so what I basically did was I came up with the idea of narrativizing it a little bit. And how I did that was I was decided to play with time a little bit. And so I began the book at the end of the story that I was telling. And the end of the story was I was traveling by bus to a town in the southeast of Turkey, and I was pulled. The bus was pulled over at a checkpoint, and there was this sort of a bit of a dicey situation that ensued, and it was a bit dangerous and whatnot. And so I had this moment of fear and consternation that resulted in me, asking myself, well, what the hell am I doing here? How did I get here to this point? And so the rest of the book is a flashback, is a series of flashbacks of what led me to that moment. And so I decided to put that into into that frame story. And I went through all of the different stories that I wanted to tell in the book through that series of flashbacks, one after the other, generally chronological, but also jumping back and forth once in a while. And then when you reach the end of the book, you return to the frame story, back at the checkpoint, and then we go on to the last bit of the story in the book, which then wraps up everything. And so it was a way to innovate. It was a way to play with time and to solve that problem that I had with maybe it wouldn't be so interesting as having them just as a bunch of straight up travel stories without any kind of connection or narrative thread.
Well, it's also not it's a great read because it clips along, which I think you've done a great job on that level. It's also not just a straight up linear book. It's kind of a like the title, the Patchwork Cloak. It's a patchwork of stories. So wh- what is that exactly? I mean, did what I think in the past there have been others who've done those kinds of books. Were you kind of inspired by others, by other writers, etc., to do such a patchwork?
Hmm. I mean, in terms of more modern literature and writing. I mean, writers like David Mitchell with his Cloud Atlas. I mean, that's something that influenced me in terms of taking that same approach of having a sort of disparate collection of narratives that somehow connect without, you know, obviously connecting, kind of thing. And so that was one influence, but also too, and this makes the whole East-West theme more relevant in a way, is that I was inspired by um, Eastern storytelling traditions like the Thousand and One Nights, the Arabian Nights collection, which uses the frame story device, and another collection of stories, the Panchatantra, series of animal tales that originated in India and even further east, thousands of years ago, that also used the frame story device. And then, of course, Boccaccio in his Decameron, more in the Middle Ages, who also took from those traditions. Again, that sort of collection of stories that, although the stories are standalone in some way, somehow implicitly connect and create a kind of an impression that is sort of larger than the sum of its parts, and that in a sense is what sort of clicked in my mind when I decided to kind of take this approach to doing the book.
Well, it worked. So thanks for taking it. But maybe for those of us that don't know, maybe quickly tell us what exactly is a frame story?
So essentially, it's a story within a story device. And so, in the Arabian Nights collection, for instance, there is this king Shahryar who is this sort of psychopathic king, and he lures these sort of women into his court, and he kills them every night, kind of thing. And so, he's just like a serial killer type of character. And so, Shahrazad, who's one of his next victims, finds herself as his next potential victim, but she decides to tell him a story every night to delay her murder or her execution, kind of thing. And so that is the frame story. They're in the palace. She's telling him a story, and then every story in the Thousand and One Nights is her telling a story. But then, to make it more interesting, there are stories that occur within the stories she's telling. So it's sort of like those Russian Matryoshka dolls. Is that how you pronounce them? They're kind of like, it's like a story within a story within a story. And so, although I didn't get that complex with it, it was just really kind of one frame story and then a series of tales. It's drawing on the same tradition.
Got it. Excellent. So you also mentioned just a few minutes ago that you were on a quest. Can you tell us what that quest was about? And through that, in a way, what did you learn about yourself on this journey? I don't mean just writing the book now, but the actual events that you detail so well in the book. What did you learn about yourself? Maybe about identity, etc.
So when I went back and looked at all of the memories that became the basis of stories, and I sort of took in the whole span of my journeys throughout the Middle East, in a sense, I realized that I was looking for sort of a more Eastern persona, and or a more vibrant Eastern persona, or an Eastern life that I could connect to, become part of, a kind of, in a sense, a sort of belonging, in a sense, and that plays out in every story to some degree. And I find myself in the situations that I'm in, whether they're travels through landscapes, whether they're situations in cities involving local people. Uh, I find myself kind of looking for something. And so, in terms of the frame story, the bus journey, I'm going to visit my grandfather's ancestral town in southeastern Turkey, in a town called Mardin, which is sort of the last stage. It's my last attempt to connect with the Middle East. And so that, in a sense, is the sort of the quest, in a way, is that, and I begin in Egypt. I end up going to Lebanon and to sort of Syria and to those sorts of places, and it never really quite worked out. And then going to Mardin is my last sort of attempt to kind of to connect with the really old history of the family. And I mean, in terms of what I've learned from looking back at those travels and during those travels, I mean, I don't want to preempt the end of the book because, in a sense, the last chapter kind of it sort of explores all of that. But I mean, I think at the time I was really very black and white about the way I saw East and West and how I related to each and how I was trying to kind of reconcile the two. It was very difficult because I sort of felt that it had to be more one over the other or one at the expense of the other, when in fact the boundaries really they blur as much as you want them to in a way, right? So, as you know, I'm sure someone with your mixed ancestry would appreciate. So, I don't really want to get into that too much, but I mean, I will say because it might sort of spoil the end of the book for anyone who wants to read it. But I would say too that I think another important point is that, and again, you see this in some of the stories as well, in sort of the crazy situations that I find myself in, is that I was very much motivated and drawn by a sense of excitement and stimulation and heightened emotion, which is something that the region, as you know, can very much inspire in someone who's from the outside, because just because of the nature of life, the sounds, the smells, the noises. I mean, it's a kind of a carnival-esque. It can be a carnival-esque sort of experience, and so I really had to, I think, live that out. I had to kind of work through that to get to the other side and get beyond it. And by doing all these trips and by going through the experiences I did, I think I was somehow able to render what I considered to be the extraordinary essentially ordinary for that part of the world, and kind of you get over to the other side, and and now, for instance, like I mean, I find I'm in Turkey on the southwest coast of Turkey visiting here at the moment. I'm not as affected by that or even motivated. It's kind of it's more of a kind of a pleasure sort of trip, and you know I'm no longer in that sort of headspace. And I think a lot of people who are drawn to the Middle East, especially people who go there to work or to make a career out of something involving an aspect of the region, or they're similarly motivated by that if they're from the West, and you do see that.
Well, it's interesting that the end of the exotic has its advantages. I suppose, meaning, does it mean that you see the East more clearly in a way now as a result, or?
I mean, I think it would be that for sure, but also it's sort of understanding oneself as well, and in relation to that. So I mean, I understand now better just sort of how these sort of impulses and influences affect me, and I can manage them better. And just yeah. So it is an interplay between understanding the place and understanding oneself, and sort of I guess moving beyond it, or just not having more agency and being able to deal with. In fact, I would even say now that it's sort of it's gone over to the other side more, in the sense that I'm almost too sensitive to it now, and I kind of avoid some of the things that would have excited me before in my sort of more adventurous, stimulation seeking past.
So you mentioned a bit ago that a lot of your stories are about you getting into a little bit of trouble here and there, which you seem to have been like a bit of a specialist in that, which is of course makes great fodder for a book. So all that is advantageous. Um, and your book ranges across massive geography: Saudi Arabia, Kurdistan, Lebanon, Egypt. It's covers a lot of the Middle East. What are your favorite anecdotes, and which ones really left a mark on you? But from all of them, because there are so many.
Hmm. Yeah. So again, it's it's a bit of a tough question to answer because, in a sense, one as a writer, uh, especially one who drew up a really massive list of potential story ideas, and I really whittled them down to a handful in the end. I derived a lot of satisfaction by seeing them all told in story form after having kind of existed in the ether of my imagination for so long. Um, and I think among some of the sort of more interesting ones for me were the more purely travel related ones that took place in the desert. There's an Eastern Desert hiking story where my roommates and I hiked between two Coptic Egyptian monasteries in the Egyptian desert. There was a much longer story where I explored the Sahara with a retired Egyptian army intelligence colonel who led an expedition to the border regions of Egypt, Libya, and Sudan at a time when the Darfur conflict was spilling over across the border to some degree, and there was an aspect of danger and but also moments of you know you know inspired beauty, that kind of was transcendent basically, and so that was a good one as well. But the one that I found the most satisfaction telling, because I never really thought I would actually put it down in story form, was a story that I called the Forever Kingdom, which is an account of my traveling traveling to and working in Saudi Arabia to work on a television public service announcement that I was hired to do because I was in a documentary making phase at that time. I was living in Dubai, and I was hired to be essentially to produce a counterterrorism video for broadcast, not just in Saudi but also on a sister channel that is available throughout the Middle East. And this was at the time when Bin Laden was kind of doing, he was active in Saudi with all of his attacks on the various compounds, and the government really needed to they thought they needed to sort of do something to stem the sort of the flow of youth into these groups and whatnot. And so that was a very, very, very interesting experience, as you could imagine, because it involved, I had to film the Saudi Special Security Forces. The backbone of the video was essentially talking about their counterterrorism forces and how powerful they are and how they could sort of thwart, their enemies. And in a sense, it was like brandishing a stick. And so there was a lot of kind of cross-cultural dissonance and misunderstandings and sort of really funny moments. It was at a time when 20 years ago, when Saudi was a different place. It was sort of quite a bit sort of more closed and secretive. It's changed since then. So yeah, it was a tough one to tell as well because I'd forgotten so much, and I had some notes, but then I had to go and interview and talk to some of my friends and colleagues who were also there, directors doing similar videos. So yeah, I think that kind of gave me particular satisfaction because it just sort of seemed unexpected.
You were almost trapped in Saudi forever too, if I remember right.
Well, the reason it was it was called the Forever Kingdom was because other colleagues from Dubai who had gone there to do various projects would take a very long time to come back. Like they tell me going for a few months, but in fact it would be longer because the projects would not be easily approved. And in the case of the public service announcements and the us other directors who were doing those videos, they would kind of review the videos and ask them to change things ad infinitum. And so luckily, it didn't happen with me, but it came close. So,
well, John, let's turn a bit now, a bit away from the book and towards the region itself, towards the Middle East. Both the background and the landscape for all your adventures in this book. Maybe we could talk a bit about Syria, which is a country that has, over the last year, undergone a massive political shift. You've spent a lot of time there, traveling, working. Those were in the days of Assad. Tell us a bit what that was like. What was it like to be in that Syria? Even if it's the past now, I think it's still really important to hear that. What what were your impressions of that critical country in the Middle East?
So I would say when I first started visiting Syria in the 1990s, it really stood out as a place that was quite different from the other countries that I was visiting and had visited in the region, essentially. And it had this kind of almost sort of cast in amber quality to it. It had this sort of, it felt very Soviet still, and both the architecture and the feeling and the governance of the place. There were almost no tourists, and you really did feel like you were in kind of some sort of forbidden place in a way. And I think the combination of the Cold War and the Soviet presence there, the wars with Israel, the Lebanese civil war, the proximity, geographically to it, I think really kind of, and I think also just the very sort of anti-Syrian rhetoric that was, coming out from the United States, starting probably in the 70s and into the 80s, and it sort of felt like this sort of place that you weren't supposed to be in. Yet at the same time, there were all of these sort of independent travelers, and there were a handful of people who would go there. And so I decided to just sort of explore it, because the word kind of in the traveler circles was that it was a very, very, very great place to go. And in actual fact, it turned out to be, because of that sort of lack of exposure in the local population to the West. They were sort of somehow a lot friendlier and a lot more genuine. You find that in places that have that sort of disconnect from the rest of the world. And so on one hand, you're there. It feels kind of like you shouldn't be there. It's a police state. It's an intelligence state. You have people watching you. You have people following you. Yet the people are incredibly hospitable, super friendly, and I really did get the sense at the time that this was a very important country. It was a kind of a linchpin country. It sort of was the gateway to kind of the more, interior hinterland Middle East. Yet it also had a coastal connection. It sort of stood at the sort of crossroads. I mean, people talk a lot about Turkey being this great bridge between East and West. And it is in, because of that sort of that Istanbul straddling the two literal continents. But in some ways, when I think about Syria, it feels almost Syria is really the kind of the sort of the bridge in a way. And you even see that in the people there, in their appearances, and just, like the genetics and the how they look, and, it sort of spans the gamut.
Well, I share your view about Syria almost identically, by the way, almost word for word, and from my own experiences. And I would even add just another word, which is it's kind of keystone in the region. And so what happens in Syria over the coming decade is going to be critical for the rest of the region. And so much of what you said applies to other countries in the Middle East, where from a distance they seem so unapproachable because of conflict, and yet when you go there, the human aspect is what really prevails. And speaking of that, John, there's that old expression, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. One could spend a lot of time trying to understand what that means exactly, by the way. But what given your experiences, and given the book that you've written, which is a memoir about East and West, what's your biggest takeaway about developing greater cultural understanding how do the Middle East and the West bridge these gaps of ignorance that you've just sort of talked about in Syria, but overall, do we need to even bridge that gap? What is your sense about all of that? The kind of larger picture question.
Hmm. Yeah, and if I remember correctly, that is taken from a Rudyard Kipling poem called "The Ballad of East and West," and yeah, and I mean, I guess looking back on it, it sort of seems a bit of a kind of a harsh, sort of severe statement in a sense. I mean, and I mean, I guess for those who are a little more black and white thinking, a bit more literal minded, more dogmatic perhaps, uh, they might be able to find evidence of that, especially in sort of harder edged examples of in politics or history, the Crusades, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Gaza at the moment, 9/11 and its aftermath, those sorts of things. But I, I mean, I guess when you for taking that line broadly, and we apply it to kind of softer fields of culture, for instance, and I mean, you just look at the cultural intermingling in places like London and Berlin, and where East and West are in constant contact with one another. Less obvious places, Vancouver and Vladivostok, they're essentially outposts of the West in the East and outposts of the East in the West, in these sort of lesser known places where you wouldn't necessarily consider them to be East-West sort of minglings. And of course there's examples in history, the transference of knowledge from the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, from North Africa into Spain, and from Islamic Sicily into Europe, and from the Abbasids in Baghdad. And so, I mean, there's countless examples. There are individual examples like myself and like you and like Kamal Bey, who is a character in the book, a linchpin character who embodied, these are all living refutations. Countless people have mixed backgrounds now. So East and West do meet. It's not that they never meet. They do, on various levels. And so that's one way of looking at it. Is that the interface is happening at so many levels in so many places, including in the Middle East. But I mean, there's maybe a more philosophical question we can ask with regards to that, and that is you know um, what is East and West really, other than, I guess, cultural attitudes, behaviors, ways of life that exist at the surface above something else which sort of connects everyone, right? And so, and I guess, you know, does Asia and Europe see things so differently that they can't find common ground or agree on a lot of other things? And I think, in a sense, I think it's the shared humanity between these regions that we've kind of given names to and defined that is the sort of real reality beyond the details, the specifics of how one defines oneself at the surface.
The word shared humanity is a good one to begin to understand. It's one that's thrown around a lot. It's easy to just say shared humanity. It's also something that's part of our effort at the Conciliators Guild, which is maybe part of having a shared humanity is to understand better what a human being is. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do, which is to get out the most basic information about human needs, human psychology, human behavior patterns that we all share, that are universal. And so I obviously do share that with you, this view that is one way to bridge the cultural understanding. And your book does that. And I think people, its very title says that, Patchwork Cloak of Kamal Bay, an East-West memoir, and so it does that. But one final question: who is Kamal Bey? Since he's in the title, and apparently wears a patchwork cloak. So tell us a bit more about Kamal Bey as a last final question.
Kamal Bey was a friend of my father's from the Egypt days before they both moved separately to Canada. Friend of the family's, and he was a very wise, old world, gentlemanly figure who was both rooted in East and West. He was an Egyptian. He had his ancestry similar to my family as well in Syria and in Lebanon and parts of Turkey and that sort of thing. But he also always felt himself drawn to the West, and so he was a mentor figure for me because he was very interested in the Middle East. He had a kind of a national security secret job in Canada that he never really talked about, but involved the Middle East. And he was a great lover of history, of politics, of larger than life historical and literary figures. And so he was this counterpoint to me in the story, in that, you know, I was going east to seek the East, but he came west to seek the West. And so, and we both felt uneasy between the civilizations. I mean, even though on the outside he seemed like the perfect amalgam of both worlds, he often doubted his decision to move west, and often felt that by coming west, he'd lost his connection to the more vital aspects of the East, especially the social aspects and, you know, the, the things that kind of inspired, you know, my journeys there. And so we mirror each other in the story. He appears in some of the stories, and the reason I kind of called the book "The Patchwork Cloak of Kamal Bay" was that he was a spinner of yarns, and he told a lot of stories.
He sounds like a very, very interesting figure, actually, and he was an inspiration, obviously, for you.
Yeah, he was. He very much was. I think in some ways I was aspiring to be like him, to be able to navigate both worlds, and to do so in a way that was very confident and elegant and seamless, which is how he operated and how he appeared. And I mean, he was able to. He studied. He was a lawyer by study, and his specialty was Islamic Sharia law. He was a Christian, which is almost unheard of, and he was able to recite parts of the Quran by memory. Yet at the same time, he could quote, you know, French authors from the 18th century, and I mean, he was quite worldly. So I think in a sense he embodied that person that I was trying to become by going east, and as a result, he had a very special place in the book.
Well, I guess we all owe Kamal Bey some gratitude for having inspired you to write the book, but also all the people that you met, who are of a great diversity of people that led to all your anecdotes and adventures. So, John, thank you for this discussion. We've ranged over quite a diversity of issues from writing. For those who are aspiring writers, I think they'll find a lot of what you said about how you wrote this book very interesting, to the Middle East itself, to gaps of culture and how to bridge them. So thank you very much, John. I hope many grab the book up for Christmas. It's kind of a perfect Christmas gift, I think, for a lot of people who are interested in the Middle East. Thanks for being on Upstream, John. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.